Started. Okay, good evening and good morning, depending where you are right now. This is a class that I have been looking forward to teaching for literally for a few years. And for those of you who've been in classes of mine over the last few years, and especially this last year, you've heard me mention many, many times that I was going to be teaching a class in Tanya. So for me personally, this is very exciting. I'm going to start off with a quote that is familiar to many of you before we get started, and that is Kol hatchalot kashot. Literally means that all beginnings are difficult, but the truth of the matter is it's not true. You figure like a new project, new something, it's exciting. It's I'm very excited about tonight. And I know some of you said that you've been looking forward to this. And what do you mean it's difficult? So I heard once that a person tell me that it's not the actual beginning of something that's difficult, but it's maintaining that same level of excitement and joy and anticipation. So I'm hoping over the next however long it's going to take us to learn this book of Tanya, that this will stay this level of excitement. For those of you who have been with me for years, we just finished the book of the Kuzari after about five and a half years, whatever it took us. And this won't take us, I don't think will take us 5 years. It'll take us less, Bezrat Hashem, but we'll see where it takes us. I want to make a couple of introductory comments. This will be especially helpful for people who are just coming to my class for the first time, but it's good also for people who've been with me for quite a while. Bezrat Hashem, every class I teach, and this has been going on since, I guess, beginning Corona, at least. When I'm on Zoom, I also video, or what do you call it, tape it, record it, and that gets uploaded to my channel on YouTube. So if you miss a class, worst comes to worst, you just watch it on YouTube. I consider this interactive to the extent that during class you have questions, please you'll be asking. And also if during the week between classes you have questions, comments, something, message me, and I will sometimes answer it in the group, and sometimes I'll answer it in just directly, or sometimes in the class itself. As I mentioned, both in the Facebook post and WhatsApp group, by the way, I'm sorry, today of all days, I've been starting to get this, the winter cold that everyone seems to be getting. So sorry if I'm coughing a little bit, which is another reason I'm glad we're not in person. That this week and possibly part of next week, Bezrat Hashem, will be more history, because in order to walk into the book of Tanya and to start to meet the author, to understand where this book comes from, how did it get written, who is this individual who wrote it, we really need context. And the context cannot be just with starting with what is Hasidut, because that really doesn't give us the whole picture. We're going to go back a couple hundred years even before that. We'll start with that tonight, and it'll probably take us tonight and next week. Class will be 45 minutes, Bezrat Hashem. You do not need, when we do actually start the book, which will be either next week or right after, you do not need the actual book. I'll post a sheet that has the page or pages we'll be doing. But I will suggest that as time goes by, if it's something you find yourselves interested in, that you get the copy of the book. There are multiple different types of copies, and I'll be happy to explain that as we move along. There are books with absolutely no commentary, books with lots of commentary. It's in probably almost every language you can think about. So at the beginning, if you don't have a book, it's perfectly fine, especially this week and next week. I also will say two things, multiple things. The book, when I talk about people, I've said, oh, I'm going to start teaching a class in Tanya. The first reaction from many people has been, oh, I didn't know you were a Chabadnik, and I'm not. I also used to think that the book is geared to the Chabad audience. And had I believed that always, forever, then that would have made me a very poor individual when it comes to certain areas of Torah and connection to Hashem. It is not any way, shape, or form just the sole domain of Chabad. But because I don't have a Chabad background, means that the way I will be teaching it is based on how I've learned it with a Chabadnik, but doesn't mean I come with rich stories of the Alter Rebbe and this Rebbe, and that's not who I am. I will throw in interesting, hopefully, vignettes from Reb Nachum Mendel Schneerson. I'll also talk about, obviously, many, many times, the man who's known by 3 titles: the Alter Rebbe, the Reb Schneer Zalman from Liadi, who we'll meet tonight or next week, who is the author. He's also known as Admor HaZaken, and also well, you know what? I don't want to jump ahead. We'll get back to the titles.
Tanya.
The Tanya is one of the other ones, yes. The author
right.
of the Tanya itself, and why he called it, we'll see. After I do the history tonight, and again, maybe next week a little bit if I don't finish it tonight, I'll give you basically the structure of what the book is, how it's structured, and then we'll get started, Bezrat Hashem. One thing to be really clear about as far as Tanya, there are many books out there that deal with Dveikut Hashem, how to get closer to Hashem, how to be a better person, and many of them you can sometimes read one chapter, jump ahead, go back, and you cannot do that in Tanya. Tanya builds and builds and builds on itself. You're going to learn different meanings of words that you've heard before that are going to take on a completely different connotation. You're going to learn about topics that you've maybe never heard of before, topics you've heard of and will have a different twist, and hopefully open your minds. The purpose of learning Tanya, we'll discuss when we get to that, the beginning of the introduction of the book. So let's go a little bit of history. If I were to tell you that the country of Fiji, F-I-J-I, the country of Fiji, which has gone through 3 name changes as far as I know, it declared its independence in the early 1900s. What would you want to know? You'd want to know, well, independence from who? From whom? Why did they declare their independence? What was going on that caused it? If I say to you that, and it is, by the way, I did a little research, that the issue of land in Fiji and the indigenous Fijians and the problems with land and other people coming from outside the country, taking land and buying land and using land, was part of the major issue. You wouldn't know what I'm talking about if you didn't have some of the context. And I chose Fiji because it's one place that one day I wouldn't mind visiting. It's a nice place to disappear for a few years, God forbid, a few days. But what I'm doing is I'm putting a little bit of context. We're actually going to go back to the time of the Renaissance. We're talking about from the mid 1300s to mid 1600s. Now, parenthetically, I'll tell you, when I was growing up, the 2 classes I hated the most in school were history and Navi. And then I fell in love with them as I became an adult, and I taught them. I've been teaching Navi, as many of you know, for the last, well, probably 20 years now, but especially here in Israel, the last 12. For those of you who are interested, I start a new class next week, the first night of Hanukkah, actually in Ezra Nehemiah on Sunday night. It's just brand new class. And if you've not joined the class and you want to join, it's the perfect time. Just send me a message. Anyways, so I really enjoy history, and it's not about dates and places and names. It's about humans. It's about stories, and it's about how we got from point A to point B. I'll give you a good example. Imagine it's 1,000 years from now, and you're reading, you're born 1,000 years from now, and you're reading about the 20th century in Israel, 20th century. And obviously you have been 1,000 years of a history now with the Beit HaMikdash, the third Beit HaMikdash, and you're reading some ancient history. And they talk about something called Yom HaAtzmaut. And that you read a paper, it says that there were some people who were very much in favor, not only of Yom HaAtzmaut, but Hallel with a bracha. And there are people who would say Tachanun, and now why? What's the context? What's the background? So you need to go back, obviously, before it's pre-state Israel and understand the differences of the approaches to Israel to understand that. It's the same type of thing we need to do here tonight. So let's talk a little bit about the Renaissance. Sorry?
I know of one person who did both.
Good.
Said,
excellent.
And Hallel and
It's say Tachanun. Yes. I know people who don't daven also don't say Tachanun or Hallel those days. Now.
No, it's Tachanun and Hallel.
Yes. Good. It's strange.
Okay.
Anyways, the word Renaissance just is French for rebirth. And the question is, rebirth of what? And this becomes the key to the next about 500 years, even though the Renaissance is only about 300 years. And that is the rebirth of knowledge, individual expression, worldly experience, literature, arts, and sciences. Because if you go back before that in what we call the Dark Ages, this was suppressed. And I'm not going to get into the whole background. If you know it, that's great. If not, not. And at this time period, during the Renaissance, there are some very powerful kings that are starting to emerge, both in England and in France, some of the powerhouses of Europe at that time. And the power of the church is beginning to wane, starting to go downhill, which is a very important point when you talk about the the Enlightenment period as well, which comes up later. And there are famous names of people you know from that time period. By the way, we're going to look, we're doing this like world history at this point, and then we're going to switch into the Jewish aspect of it in a little bit. But there's names like Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Shakespeare, Machiavelli. There's just so many names of such a rich time period of history. It's also the time period when the Jews make their way to Poland. Now, when I say Polish Jews, my guess is 95% of you instantly picture the Jewish shtetl in Poland, which makes sense because before the Holocaust within the 100 years before, that was the picture. That's really what there was the shtetl life of Poland. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about in the 15th and 16th centuries right now. And that time period, actually, Jews slowly but surely start to make their way to Poland. And the shtetl life, as we would call it, doesn't really start until the 18th century. But during the time of the Renaissance, as the Jews start to make their way into Poland, things are actually pretty good for the Jews. However, as many of you are aware, there's I don't know if it's what the word is, but there is this concept in Jewish history that almost every place where things are really good for the Jews ends up being the place where the Jews suffer the most eventually. And it happens over and over, whether it's in Europe, in the Middle East, and just in so many different places in ancient times also, obviously. But right now we're talking about really some of the best of times for the Jews at this point, because, like, for example, Spain was a phenomenal place for Jews until they got thrown out, were persecuted and thrown out. And we're going to see that in Poland, a similar thing happens. But the question is, how do the Jews come to Poland? We have to keep in mind, we're talking again in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century. During that time period, as the Jewish population of Poland begins to grow, what brought them there in the first place? So Poland became Christian very late in the game. And as Christianity began to spread and spread, Poland was one of the later countries that became Christian. Sorry. And in order to develop the country, in order to make it grow, because now as population grows and the needs of the country grow, you also need to work on the economy. You need to work on developing your country. And when you want to develop your country economically, and you want to develop your country culturally, the question is, what do you need? And the answer tends to be the Jewish people. But why? Why the Jews? Why are the Jews the ones that seem to be the ones that help to be put culture aside, bring development, economic development? Because what is that, the old stereotype? Well, the Jews got all the money, so therefore they're going to bring economic development to the country. No, they have one thing more than almost all the people in Europe at that time. And that was they were literate. They could read and write. Remember, the Jews have always put a very high price on and importance on education. Always did, always will. Talmud Torah. Because in order to learn Torah, you need to be literate for the most part. Doesn't mean that every Jew is able to read. Doesn't mean every Jew is able to write. But it meant that a large percentage could. And therefore, they were also highly educated, both in terms of general education, in terms of Judaic education. In addition to that, Jews are also excellent bankers, accountants, administrators. You say my son the accountant, my son the doctor, my son the lawyer, my daughter the doctor, whatever it might be. This is the same thing was going on for centuries. This is nothing new to the 20th or 21st century. And what happens is near the end of the 13th century, the king of Poland, whose name was Boleslav, the king Boleslav of Poland, granted a charter to invite Jews to live in Poland. Now let's just take a pause for a second. When we talk about times that are a few hundred years ago, we have to take into consideration that we have to look at it from the lens of the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, 16th centuries, not modern times. What do you mean they have a charter to invite or to allow Jews? Remember, the Jews and many other minorities were discriminated against very terribly in certain countries. And in many countries, we know the Jews were thrown out of one country after another, which we'll talk about soon. So the King Boleslav was a benevolent leader who also saw that it was necessary to bring Jews into the country. And by doing so, he granted them rights and privileges that were unheard of for Jews in that part of the world at this time period in history. As a matter of fact, in his charter, he also made a written part of the charter is that blood libels, again, those are statements that we killed Christians for their blood to bake matzahs and things of that nature. That blood libels, which very often ended up in pogroms and murder of Jews, would be, if there would, and sometimes at best, if they be expelled from their host country. Boleslav promised the Jewish people that they would not accept blood libels in the court systems in Poland. So not only were they giving them rights and privileges, it was also the king was protecting the Jews. Again, it wasn't only because he was a nice guy. He was doing it for purposes of growing his country, and he saw the Jews being able to be the ones to do this. Now, even though the doors were open and this invitation to a more privileged, enlightened country was available to the Jews, they didn't all of a sudden just flock to the country. It didn't happen like that. But what did happen? Jews started getting expelled from other countries. Famously, we know that England threw out the Jews in the 13th century, Germany in the 14th century, Italy and Portugal in the 15th century. We know that before that also Spain. So therefore, as Jews are being thrown out of country after country over a couple of centuries, there is a destination that seems to have welcoming and open arms, and that's Poland. And what happens is the Jewish population in Poland begins to grow. There's another Polish king that issues another edict that I'm going to read it to you, that it was to grant permission to open a yeshiva in Lublin in 1567. It's just 2 lines. I'm going to read it to you. As a result of the efforts of our advisors, he didn't write it in English, obviously. As a result of the efforts of our advisors, and in keeping with the request of the Jews of Lublin, we do hereby grant permission to erect a yeshiva and to outfit said yeshiva with all that is required for advanced learning. All the learned men and rabbis of Lublin shall come together, for among their number, they shall choose one to serve as the head of the yeshiva. Let their choice be a man who will magnify Torah and bring it glory. This is written by a non-Jewish Polish king, basically saying, we want the Jews to make a yeshiva. We want them to learn Torah. We want them to have a Rosh Yeshiva that they themselves will choose. We're not going to impose who's going to become the Rosh Yeshiva. And also to bring glory to Torah. He understood, again, I'm not going to digress into this, but he evidently understood the power that Torah and Jews had in being able to bring that to their country, what it could do for them. And this leads to what became what was known as the Golden Age of Spain, or the Golden Age, not the Golden, that's a different time period, the Golden Age of Polish Jewry. It was, the Jews were self-governing. Yes, they had to pay taxes and other things, but they also had a self-governing body called the Va'ad Arba Haratzot. If this were a Jewish history class, which by the way, I have a plan down the road to give a Jewish history class, at least 2 to 3 years from now. The topic of the Va'ad Arba Haratzot, or the Council of the Four Lands, is itself its own topic. That's itself an hour and a half lecture at least. I'm just mentioning it. It took basically 4 major Polish provinces, and it gave Jews representatives of all these different lands. It lasted for a very long time. They came together, they made various takanot, or various edicts or decisions that would affect the Jewish population in Poland, especially, and sometimes outside the country. And the Poles in general did not really interfere with Jewish life. We know, of course, that as time marches on, they will greatly affect Jewish life. But right now, that's more of a hands-off approach. There are also some great personalities who become very well known, and we know their names to this very day, and we make use of their books literally every day. Probably one of the most well-known is the Ramah. The Ramah, Reb Moshe Isserles, is the one who wrote the appendages or the glosses on the Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Yosef Karo had written the Shulchan Aruch in the perspective and halachic perspective of the Sephardi world. Along came Rabbi Moshe Isserles, known as the Ramah by his initials, in Krakow, and wrote addenda to the book in order to also put his own opinions in and the Ashkenazi opinion. and it combined was the Shulchan Aruch, the whole book. So he was one of those famous individuals in that time period. Also, the Maharal from Prague. And by the way, I don't want to burst your bubble, but those of you who know the legend of the Golem in Prague and Maharal, it's been debunked. Sorry. So there really wasn't a golem. I mean, doesn't mean the Maharal couldn't have done it, but I will tell you, if you have some time one day, if you're interested, I'll send you a link to where it is. If you take a look in the Shulchan Aruch, actually in the Mishnah Berurah brings a discussion about if you're allowed to count a golem to a minion. There's a whole thing. There's the Chacham Tzvi and others who discuss this whole topic, whether you're allowed to count this individual. But again, sorry to burst your bubble, the Maharal from Prague did not make a golem, and the whole story behind Unatana Tokef of he cuts his arms off and his legs off, and also was more than likely a fabricated story, in spite of the fact that it's written in an art school machzer. Okay. In any case, along with the Jews moving to Poland, what happens is the growth is so great. In 1500, there are only about 500,000 Jews. About 150 years later, there are about 50,000 Jews, and that is magnified tenfold. 150 years later, there's 500,000 Jews living in Poland, which meant that approximately in the middle of the 17th century, about 30% of the world Jewry lived in Poland. There were instances, of course, of Christian rioting. Relatively speaking, it was at this time period was small amounts of what was going on, but there were some situations. But what was also starting to leak out into the mindset of the Poles, and especially the Polish feudal lords, was the Jews who were the administrators of for the tax collectors. The Jews were the money people. The Jews are the purse strings. And that for sure did not make them very popular with the feudal lords. Again, I'm not going to get into the whole feudal system with serfs and all. It's just way beyond the scope of what I want to talk about tonight, because tonight, again, is just about getting us to the time period of the Admor HaZaken, known as the Alter Rebbe. And again, there's some, I don't want to get into too much depth, but again, Poland and Ukraine, there's a mixture, and Ukrainians pretty much lash out at the Jews in a horrific way. In the mid-17th century, with two main occurrences. Once in 1635, when there's major pogroms against the Jews, and the worst, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, 1648, we have the Khmelnytsky massacre. Khmelnytsky massacre, there's a man named Bogdan Khmelnytsky, Yamach Shemo v'zichro, who was the Hitler of his time, massacred about 100,000 Jews in Poland at that time. It was genocide. It was not, he just killed them. It was horrific. It was torture. It was terrible. Now, the sickening thing is, and I've seen this with my own eyes, I've been to Kiev, is that until this very day, Khmelnytsky is looked at as a modern day George Washington to them, or not modern day, but a George Washington to them. There's a huge statue in Kiev in his honor, because he was very good to the Ukrainians. But as a result of this massacre, as a result of this painful time period of which was this upswing, the Jews were almost not in Poland. They're in Poland. They're growing, and they're also they have these rights and they have these privileges, and they're part of society, and they're really running the show. As a result of this particular pogrom, the entire golden age of Polish Jewry comes crashing down. By the year 1649, it is a very different picture than it was 250, 300 years before that. And I want you to put that topic off to the side for a moment, because we're going to switch to a different location and we're going to combine the topics. We're going to come to Israel now. Question is, what was happening in the Jewish world as this Renaissance period is coming to an end? So one of the high concentrations of Jews starts to become Israel. And specifically, Jews are looking for a safe haven, and they find it in the city of Tzfat. In the beginning, in the city of Tzfat, there were probably about 300 families. It was a very, very tiny little, I don't want to say yishuv, but you know what I'm saying, a tiny little amount of people. It grows to about 10,000 people over X amount of time. I'm not going to, again, I don't want to get to the whole background. And it becomes the largest Tzfat at this time in the late 1600s, is becoming the main place or the highest level concentration of Jews in the land of Israel. We know, if you've been to Tzfat, and if you haven't been to Tzfat, one of the things Tzfat is known for is mysticism, Kabbalistic writings, Kabbalistic teachings. And the most famous Kabbalist of all times, of course, was the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. For those of you who have been to Tzfat, I remember my very first visit to Tzfat, you almost feel as like when you come into Yerushalayim for the first time, even now, I mean, I've been to Yerushalayim hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, Baruch Hashem, it's different. It's coming to Yerushalayim is different than going to another city. There's a different feel. And there's also a different feel in Tzfat. I had an incident. I went to when my sister was learning in Israel. I had already been back from my years in learning here. And I went back to Chicago. And my sister was learning in Bar Ilan, and I came to visit her. And we decided to take a tiyul, myself, my sister, and a friend of hers. And three of us went to Tzfat. And we went to the cemetery. It's not like it is today, where it's so laid out beautifully and tended to. It was very different. I was talking about 40 years ago and more, 45 years ago. And I went to the cemetery, and the three of us were standing talking, and there was a guy, maybe 10, not even 10 meters away from us, very close. And we're talking and we're looking around, and it's not like you have these big buildings and tall tombstones. You could see far. And we're talking maybe for a few seconds. All of a sudden, the guy was gone. It's like he disappeared. And we looked at each other like, okay, this is creepy, I guess, but this is Tzfat. Who knows what's going on? But just walking into the various shuls there, for those of you, I'm sure many of you have been in these shuls, it's just a very different feel. And it is here in the city of Tzfat where the Kabbalist teachings are not born, but are promulgated and taught and started to be spread. And the Arizal, he's known as the Arizal because the Ari, Zichrono Livracha, who was born in Yerushalayim, he relocated to Tzfat. He was only 38 years old when he died. When we have to think about that, just a parenthetical statement, how many people, the Ramah was young when he died, the Ari was young when he died, the Ben Ish Chai was young when he died, and the amount that these individuals accomplished in their lives, when we get far into about, not that far, partway into Tanya, we'll start to understand about, and we'll talk a little about Nishamot, we'll talk about how is it that certain people seem to have this ability when their Rambam wrote extensively by the time he was 18. How do these things happen? We'll be talking about that. But it did that many people started to learn Kabbalah in Tzfat. That came to learn Kabbalah there. The song we sing every Friday at the Piyut, Lecha Dodi, was first sung there by Rav Alkabetz, by Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz. His name is in the acrostic. And that's all fantastic. And it's bringing this almost a rebirth of a different perspective to Judaism. And it is giving a different insight into Judaism. And then something very bad happens. Mysticism, unfortunately, in every religion, but we're going to talk about Judaism, mysticism can also lead to taking information the wrong way and using it improperly. And it's often associated with messianic expectations. There was a man whose name I know many of you know, that we'll come to in a second, that saw an opening. Remember that at this time period, again, parallel to just before this time period I'm talking about and running into this time period, the Jewish feel, the mood, the emotions were really not in great shape between the pogroms and other things that were happening very badly to the Jewish people. And people were at the point where they had to believe it can't get any worse. The Mashiach has to be coming. And into that feel, into that moment, stepped a man named Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi was born in Turkey, and by the age of 20 was known as a chacham, or a wise man. We would call it in the Ashkenazi world, we would call it rabbi or rav. In the Sephardi world, the chacham. And he was brilliant, but at the same time, unfortunately, he was known to be mentally unstable. And because the rabbis of the community recognized him as mentally unstable, they threw him out of the country. They didn't want him in the country. And he made some wandering, started traveling around, and he finally made his way to Israel. And he ended up in Gaza, in Gaza. And in Gaza, he meets a man named Natan, who's known as Nathan in English. Nathan from Gaza, or Natan from Gaza, from Gaza. And it is he, Natan, who convinces Shabtai Tzvi that he is the Mashiach. He is absolutely the Messiah. Now, it was so well believed by so many people that there are books that were printed at that time period that have him sitting with a crown as Melech HaMashiach on a throne. Now, some of you in your minds just went to, whoa, that's the Lubavitcher Rebbe. That's what they're doing, the same thing. We're going to discuss that way, way, way down the road, because that's not for discussion tonight at all, which is modern day Chabad. That's going to come much later. I don't want you to get sidetracked by that, because by doing that, we're talking about a topic, besides it being a sensitive topic, which I'll be happy to discuss, we're also talking about two different personalities completely, because the Shabtai Tzvi was arrested when he went to the Sultan, and he tried to get the Sultan to do certain things, and the Sultan basically sees as a fraud. He throws him in jail, gives him a choice. You can either die or you can convert to Islam. He converts to Islam, and of course all the Jews are dejected by this sudden change of heart, and he's not who they thought they were, versus one of the greatest Jews that ever lived, who changed the face of Judaism literally around the globe. So we can't even compare them, put them in the same sentence. But he fooled the people. He fooled the people. Obviously, he knew himself that he wasn't the Messiah. And when he converted to Islam, there was another one named Yaakov Frank shortly after him. People believed he was Mashiach. And again, he was found to be a false Messiah. And there was a backlash as a result of this. Now you're going to see where we're building to with this whole story, this history. The backlash was that some of the people who were not involved in mysticism type of world, such as the Chacham Tzvi and his son Rabbi Yaakov Emden, names that may or may not be familiar to you. And again, if it was a Jewish history class, I'd give you details on them. They came out blaming mysticism and Kabbalistic teachings for this entire fiasco. Because if you didn't have this mysticism background and feel in Kabbalistic teaching, no one would have thought that this person potentially could be Mashiach, and therefore look what you've done. You've made things even worse, and you can't listen to them. And therefore, when one man wrote a book, and this book was called the Mesilat Yesharim, and it also had he himself had some mystical background. And those of you who come to my Mesilat Yesharim class Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m., you're all welcome to join. You'll know that I talked about this when we introduced the book. Ramchal, Reb Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who wrote the book, was thrown out. He was hounded out of the country of Italy. And because it was said, no, we can't have mysticism. We can't have mystics. We got to get rid of this guy, no matter who he is. And it wasn't until way after he died that his book, Mesilat Yesharim, became very popular. So what have we had so far? We have a great time period for Jews in Eastern Europe. Things go very bad. We have things on an upswing in Israel. We have still a very tough mood, though, for the Jewish people. We have a man coming in there who gives hope to the Jews. The hopes are dashed. And with this background, as we reach the 18th century, we see then the birth of what's known as Hasidism, which we're going to talk about now for a little bit. Now, I also want to point out something really cool. Someone pointed this out to me many years ago, and I said, oh, that's pretty interesting. And I stuck it in the back of my head. And I knew I'd need to use it. And I've used this idea before, but many of you have not been with me for all these years, so I'm going to use it again. If you look at world history, you will find that things go in waves. For example, in the early, for the many of us remember in the early 1900s, the early 1990s, when we literally watched live TV as communism started on a domino effect, started to fall apart. We find where there was a few years ago, this concept of Arab Spring, that one country after another started rolling into other countries where there would be this revolt against the government and try to reestablish, which unfortunately was not very helpful and very successful in most cases. But things happen in clusters. For those of you who know your American history and know your French history, you know that in the late 1700s, in 1776 and in 1794, the French Revolution, I think it was 1794, you correct me if I'm wrong, were the American and French revolutions. This is the exact same time period we're going to talk about now of the birth of the Hasidic movement, and the Baal Shem Tov, who will change the face of Judaism with the birth of Hasidut, or Hasidism. So we had the concept of revolution. Now, by the way, revolution doesn't mean good or bad, it just means it's major change. There's a revolution in America, there's a revolution in France, there's a revolution in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the face of in the Jewish world itself. So I'm going to talk just for a couple of minutes about the Baal Shem Tov, which will lead us into the topic of what's called the Misnagdim. Okay, I'm being told. Oh, is there a problem with the audio? Or are you not here? Is everyone hearing me? Does someone respond? There's only one person saying she can't hear.
I can hear.
You can hear? Okay, so maybe share it.
I hear.
Okay, so maybe share it's on.
We can hear you.
We can
Okay,
hear
good.
you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Spartacus. Anyways, if you know the
You need
reference.
to mute everybody again.
Yeah, I
now.
need to mute everybody again. Yes, I'm going to do that right now. Okay, thanks. So maybe share it's just on your end. I don't know. I'm sorry. You'll listen to the tape. We're going to talk just for a few minutes now about Hasidut. And we'll leave to the next week the opposite side of the coin, which I would have called the mitznagdim or misnagdim, which are those who were against Hasidut. Yeah, he gives me the thumbs up here. Okay, so the Baal Shem Tov is born at the end of the 17th century, 1698. He's born in Podolia, which is now in Ukraine, and he studies in the secret society of Jewish mystics called the Nistarim. He eventually becomes a very revered rabbi. He becomes known, he travels from community to community, becomes known as a healer, a holy man. He never wrote anything. All of his teachings were verbal. It's only his students that eventually write things, that he himself never wrote any Sfarim. But what was it? What was his message? What was he doing? His teaching revolutionized the Jewish people at that point in history. Remember that Europe is in some form of, and partially in Israel, a collective depression in light of what had happened between the massacres and the pogroms and the false messiahs, two of them. The average Jew barely eking out a living, poor. Therefore is also a decrease in Jewish scholarship. And by doing that, the average Jew is not connecting intellectually, spiritually with Hashem. And the Baal Shem Tov sought to change that, to do something about that. He believed that what was necessary for the Jewish people to survive, to grow, was to connect to Hashem in a different way. I shouldn't say necessarily different, in an additional way. And that was the idea of bringing Hashem into all aspects of one's life through intense tefillah and also through joy and singing. The Hasidic movement emphasized the idea of dveikut, or clinging to God. And these are topics we're going to obviously get quite a bit into as we move along. This idea of spirituality, this idea of not just reading a book or reading words, but actually tapping into spirituality, catches on like wildfire. This Hasidic movement, Baal Shem Tov, when he died in 1760, and right before, again, these revolutions, he was succeeded by Reb Dov Meir from Mezerich. These are names that you may or may not be familiar with. And what happens after the Baal Shem Tov, and then with Reb Dov Ber, is there are now, instead of having a single figurehead, there are different groups of Hasidim with their own Rebbe, some of whose names you'll know over the course of about 100 years, the Kutzker, the Sanzer, the Libels, Lubavitch, Skver, just many. They have what was called the Chatzer, they had the Rebbe. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to the Hasidic movement, one of whom was Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who is the Alter Rebbe, the Admor Zaken, whom we'll talk about next week. I want to get into him tonight. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on the whole birth of Hasidic movement, because I want to just mention, I am going to mention still tonight as a teaser. We have all these people who are teaching this idea of spirituality, which was really a new idea for the average Jew. Spirituality always existed, obviously. But for the average Jew, the guy, now we're talking the shtetl, who has this, what do you mean? We can sing. We can have some enjoyment in our tefillah. We don't have to, besides davening, we have other ways to connect to God. There was a whole new idea. What were people afraid of? Why were there mitnagdim? What would be so bad? What's so bad about that? Well, because it makes a longer tefillah. No, it has nothing to do with that. We'll see next week. We're going to talk about these mitnagdim, or again, misnagdim, which these titles still exist today, but they don't have the same meaning any longer, obviously. We'll talk about two things next week. Well, the idea of the Hasidim and mitnagdim, what were they against? What caused them to be against the whole Hasidic movement? We'll talk a little biography of Rav Shneur Zalman himself, the author of Tanya, and then we're going to begin the book of Tanya. That Bezrat Hashem is the plan. Now, I do know next week is Hanukkah, Bezrat Hashem, and Dafka, as I said to my Navi class, we're Dafka going to learn during Hanukkah, because if you think about it, the Syrian Greeks wanted to abolish Torah during Hanukkah. So that's why I always make it a point of teaching, even if one person shows up, even if I'm talking to myself, which I do anyways, but not online. So we'll have class again, Bezrat Hashem, next week. The video will usually be uploaded the same night or the next day, and I'll put the link on the group. And if you have any questions about tonight, you have any comments about tonight, please feel free to message me on WhatsApp. If you want something in the group, you can do it in the group, otherwise directly to me. And if you are, yes, I was just asked, I am teaching Mesilat Yesharim, but I'm teaching it now for about 3 months, maybe more. It's 9 o'clock on Wednesday mornings. It's the only one I teach in person and on Zoom, and all the other classes that I taught so far are already on the YouTube channel. You can find any older ones. I'm in the middle of chapter 5. So if anyone wants to join that, just message me offline and I'll be happy to add you, and you can just pop in and watch whenever you want. And same is true with the other classes, the Navi class, which starts up again Sunday night, Bezrat Hashem, and the Mesilat Yesharim class. I hope you found tonight enlightening, a little bit interesting, I hope. I know it's history, but in order to get to Tanya, we have to put it into context. What drove the Rebbe to write this book? Okay, or the Alter Rebbe.
Is this the book that we'll be using?
Yes, the one you have in your hand now. I can't, if I'm not mistaken, that is some of them you'll find out there are like a summary of chapters, not necessarily word for word. So I have to take a look at it. If you show it to me in person, I'll tell you, but it probably is the correct one.
I think this came with a set of five.
Yeah, then it is. Then that is, because the whole Tanya, which we're going to learn about, is multiple volumes. There's Tanya, and there's the Shar HaYichud, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to focus on the first section called Tanya, which itself will take us at least 2.5 years to learn, is my guess, minimum. I've been doing it in depth. I've literally written thousands of notes on this over the last couple of years, and it took me, it's going to take us time to get through, and I'm looking forward to it. And for those who are not in the time zone for 9 a.m. for Israel, you will be able to catch it online. And if you get to Israel, Bezrat Hashem, the Karov, you'll be able to join in person as well. Have a wonderful evening. Have a wonderful afternoon, wherever you are.
Thank you very much.
Bezrat Hashem, we'll see you either tomorrow morning or Sunday night.
Thank you very,
or next
very
Tuesday
much.
night. All right, be well. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.